All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is September 25th, 2023. This is Daniel Ari Friedman, and today will be a postdoc review stream. So let's get right into it with the roadmap. I'll start with the .0 section, providing some background and context. Then most of the stream will be in the .1, going over some of the working areas of the postdoc period, specifically biology, entomology, active inference, cognitive security, meta-science, and philosophy in the arts. Following the .1 section, we'll go into a .2, have a brief review and discussion, and also I will then take a look at the YouTube live chat. So if you add any comments or questions during the stream, I'll do my best to address them at the end of the stream. Let's get right into the background and context. So here's kind of a one-pager or one slide on how I got to a few of the places where I got to. I did my PhD from 2014 to 2019 at Stanford University, working with Professor Deborah Gordon. And for each of those 5 years, I also performed fieldwork in the Arizona, New Mexico region. So there were many opportunities for beautiful views at the Southwestern Research Station. There were many meaningful backpacks, many ants to count, many ants to dissect, many ants to freeze and extract and analyze. And following my defense in July 2019, I was professionally unemployed for a year, and meanwhile was applying for the postdoc fellowship that we'll be talking about today, which began from October 1st, 2020. We are now about a week away from October 1st, 2023, which is the official ending. And here's some slices of life in Davis. Riding bikes safely, of course. Dissecting other insects. More meaningful backpacks. A lot of drawing, the library, and generally great times to be back at UC Davis, which is also where I did my undergraduate and met my wife. The grant specifically, in terms of the program, was integrative research investigating the rules of life, governing interactions between, although it could be among, genomes, environment, and phenotypes. And this grant, or program, looks into the creative integration of diverse subdisciplines of biology using combinations of observational, experimental, theoretical, and computational approaches to discover underlying principles operating across hierarchical levels of life. And some of the aims of this program are to develop new understandings of how higher order structures and functions of biological systems result from the interactions of heterogeneous biological components, and also to further predictive capability of how key properties and mechanisms of living systems emerge from interactions amongst their subunits, genomes, environments, and phenotypes. And pasted here is the abstract that I wrote, and it's broadly colored in 3 different areas. Red representing insect focus, green representing complex biological systems, and blue representing broader impacts. This grant was co-advised by Professor Brian Johnson at UC Davis and Professor Tim Linksvayer, who began at Penn and then moved to Texas Tech, and now he's at Arizona State. And the abstract, as with many sections of this review stream, one can pause if they want to review the full text. But broadly, I propose to investigate integrative phenotypic analysis in the Hymenoptera, the order of insects containing species such as ants, bees, wasps, and sawflies. And I sought to connect complex biological systems perspectives and emerging techniques and apply them in the context of a well-studied and awesome and biodiverse clade of insects, the insects being the Hymenoptera, and meanwhile engage in science communication, mentoring, and outreach programs. This is what I proposed and was very happy and honored to receive it, and so set off that way. But just to conclude the .0 before we jump into the work itself, here's a one-slide meme summarizing what actually did happen. So on the top is Spirit Drake planning what could have happened between October 2020 and 2023, which was to begin with a systematic analyses of the different kinds of phenotypic data and measurements that were available in the eusocial insects, from the genomic data and other omic data like gene expression analysis, protein expression analysis, and then to integrate that with progressively larger scale phenotypic data at the nestmate and colony scale, and ultimately the niche and the ecological variable. And then, so the plan went, it would be possible to link these traits and eventually end up somewhere, which to be fair is still in the future, end up with some kind of integrative model that would target the Hymenoptera but also transfer to other multi-scale biological systems. And I have to say, though, to each listener, be their own judge, it went slightly different and was much more of a triple helix and a weaving between or among research, education, and service over the years. So, on to the dot one and the working areas specifically. So first, what's not covered in this stream? Things I've forgotten. Works in progress or review. Private, secret, and silent work, as well as local Davis engagements and activities, which may or may not be stickers or flyers, but I wouldn't necessarily know about that. And as stated in the roadmap, the areas we're going to cover are biology, entomology, active inference, cognitive security, metascience, and philosophy and the arts. To give kind of a graphical overview, this bar chart shows the number of publications by year per working area. And for each working area, there are 4 bars representing the number of outputs just by count in 2020, 21, 22, and 23. Now, when thinking about how to even grasp with this presentation, I received an excellent suggestion, which was to utilize large language models, hashtag 2020-23. And so what I did is I used the GPT-4 capacity via Perplexity AI to upload each paper, and I asked each paper the following prompt, which I'll read now. Please deeply analyze the attached paper and do all needed background research in order to be a professional expert in the area. Then, output 3 semantically crystalline paragraphs of 2 to 6 sentences, which to a human reader will elegantly convey the paper's context, the broader background of the work, which does not mention the paper's contribution approach at all, contributions, specifically what the paper uniquely did, developed and introduced, implications, the causal consequences of the paper in our complex world, and directions for future work and research. So, for the next part of the stream, I'm going to transition over to the public and interactable website, which can be found at cognitivesecurity.us. And for each of these works, I'll quickly go over it and describe how I see it relating to the primary working area and thus furthering the direction of the grant and program. You can pause the video to read the GPT-4 answers for context, contribution, and implications, which I'll broadly just be scrolling over to keep this section kind of shorter and spontaneous. However, please feel free to visit the website and click the Perplexity link, which is going to be shown in a second, to continue the conversation and interact with the work. It's pretty cool. You can share a link to a given chat and then continue the conversation with that uploaded PDF. And after this overview section over at the Coda, I will then cover 10 highlights, just tried to sample across different areas, pull out a few more figures and a few dots that may or may not be connected. So let's jump into it. So this is what the page looks like at cognitivesecurity.us, the page called Interact with Research. So as stated, the prompt is on the right. That was the prompt that each of the papers was then juxtaposed with, and it's the Perplexity column that you can click to continue the conversation with that paper. So I've collapsed the earlier work, and now we'll just quickly go through the papers that are not collapsed. So in the area of pure biology, theoretical biology, the 2023 paper, A Variational Synthesis of Evolutionary and Developmental Dynamics. The context is, while there's been a lot of qualitative, quantitative, and empirical work within the area known as Eco-Evo-Devo, ecology, evolution, and development, without somewhat of an analytical scaffold, it's really hard to compare results and say anything too much deeper than this is important here and it's not important there. So we wanted to use active inference and the free energy principle to go beyond this. And in this work, which had a primacy of the heavy lifting done by Carl Friston, we built on the multi-scale active inference, free energy principle, formalism for cognitive systems, and specifically introduced the usage of the renormalization group to provide articulation or scale separation, rather than, for example, a nested partially observable Markov decision process. The implication is that there's a really nice and extensible approach to modeling multi-scale systems that's compatible and consistent with active inference. And so it's really exciting to think about how we might be applying that. Into the active inference proper area. A paper that I'm including from September 2020, so right before things got started with the postdoc, was Active Inference and Behavior Engineering for Teams by Vatkin et al. And the context is, although many people at that point in time had talked about active inference in the setting of communication and to a lesser extent digital communication, we saw a big opening to talk about remote teams and organizations. So we focused on the remote team system of interest and sought to apply the active inference ontology as well as fuse it with a systems engineering approach so that we could better get a grasp on remote team formation and lifecycle management. And the implications were several empirically. Following that, sorry about that. Just had a switch of window. Just give me 1 second to get the right one back. All right, there we go. I was just trying to crop it a little bit better, but that's what happens when one is cropping while they speak. Isn't it? Measure twice, cut once, not the other way around. Following this work on systems engineering and active inference and remote teams, we immediately dove into our subsequent work with the Active Inference Institute, initially known as Active Inference Lab. Continuing on with active inference. In 2022, we, along with a big team of co-authors, wrote an active inference ontology for decentralized science, from situated sense making to the epistemic commons. And the context was, in the Web3 or crypto space, as well as outside, there were various threads seeking to improve the state of science, education, research, dissemination, all of this, ranging variously from the DeSci tag, distributed or decentralized science, coming more from a crypto side, or a slightly older term, open science, and all that this comes along with. And here also we saw a variety of different solutions and different approaches, different considerations being proposed. However, analogous to the case with the theoretical biology or Eco-Evo-Devo setting, little in the way of understanding how these different modules or motifs might actually interact. And so we developed an active entity ontology for active cognitive scientific systems. The top level of the ontology is essentially a split between active entities, which are able to take actions in a space, informational or cyberphysical or otherwise, and then the informational entities, which are passive entities holographic screens that host information, and active entities modify and read and do things with those informational entities. And we, to a somewhat extent, continued to develop EOS, the active entity ontology for science, but even qualitatively or informally, we're able to use it in a lot of different settings, and that was a great nucleus of collaboration in Active Inference Institute. In 2022, working with Sean O'Connor, a really creative and motivated colleague, we wrote Predictive Processing Interpretation of the Mirror Test and Implications of a Reflection Prediction for Human Cognition. And in this work, which Sean led, and I was happy to contribute some active inference knowledge, we reinvestigated the setting of the mirror test, which is a well-known ethological exemplar where a given entity is shown its own reflection in a mirror, and then people interpret what it does or doesn't do following that presentation. We situated that setting for behavior within an active inference style approach, and we discussed the notion of a reflection prediction, as well as exploring how a few different cases where that reflection prediction does or doesn't happen, for example, in different pathological settings, or also in the developmental and evolutionary arising of self-prediction. Working with Jakob Smickel, we wrote a catechism, which is really an overview, not necessarily a full paper. We wrote a catechism at the beginning of the year, pointing towards a project that we called Towards Active Diffusion, a tale of multiple densities. So this was when there was a lot of excitement around diffusion models. It was kind of the pre-GPT transformer type stable diffusion excitement period. And we wanted to connect active inference with diffusion models in theory and in practice. So we just laid out a couple directions, sent it a few places, saw who might want to collaborate or fund the work. No one did. And so we carried on with our life, but wove it into our later work. In the work with Virginia Blue Knight and R.J. Corday, we wanted to analyze the literature environment for the free energy principle and active inference. And so we carried out a systematic literature analysis. The context is that while people anecdotally in the space may believe that there's a growing excitement or activity around publishing in active inference, such anecdotes remained essentially unsubstantiated beyond just loose keyword and citation trend searches. And so what we did was we performed a literature meta-analysis. We found all the papers through several different search engines that were either using the term free energy principle or active inference, and we paid special attention to works with Carl Friston as an author. And then we performed several analyses based upon terms usage. We applied the active inference ontology extremely proactively, and we're really looking forward to the continued development of this knowledge engineering direction where we can use the active inference ontology in reference and relationship with the empirical usage of those kinds of language in the niche. Another small stub of a project was also with Jakob and several others who were a little bit less involved, systems modeling and cognitive audits for Hypersert Ecosystems. So in the DeSci space at that time, some people had proposed a mechanism called a Hypersert as a NFT, non-fungible token, based technique to trace impact and contribution and ultimately reward it in scientific ecosystems. And we were inspired by that vision. However, we quickly looked at the specifications and realized, well, it's all good to connect up as a big pool, donors to researchers to consumers of information products or whatever it was. But at some level, or at some point, you would need to get to the granularity of being able to address single agents taking single actions, essentially to have an agent-based model. And so we applied EOS, discussed above, and proposed a funding plan for developing a cognitive auditing environment for decentralized systems and other epistemic ecosystems. And again, it was an extremely fun project to prepare for. We applied for a grant. We did not get that grant. In 2023, again, continuing with Jakob, who I'm really excited to see begin graduate school this year. We wrote Generalized Notation for Active Inference Models. Here's the context. There's a lot of ways that generative models are reflected in the active inference literature, variously in prose, analytical representations, code, pseudocode, all these different ways that people talk about generative models, which is at the heart of active inference modeling. And where there are implementations, for example, in Python with PyMDP or in Julia with RxInfer, when the implementation is shown and in hand, sometimes it's easy to get lost in the details of the implementation, and that creates a big gap, a gap within a gap, between the analytical representations and even the pseudocode and the code itself. And so we wanted to pull back and develop a notation system or a second order notation system that would enable us to carry out what we call the triple play, which is a high integrity representation of generative models across modalities, specifically linguistic, that's natural language, could be different natural languages, visual, which is to say graphical, and executable cognitive models in terms of simulations. GNN was a great paper to work on. It really advanced our understanding of active inference, and I'm super optimistic and excited for those who will continue to develop with the Institute GNN and bring in all these exciting developments that are happening in active inference related to category theory, constructor theory, and all these different things that are happening, and pull back to a level where we can play with it and tinker with it and develop systems that'll render the triple play for us really, really well. Next paper in 2020-23 in the active inference area was to comment or not to comment. That is the question. A comment on to copy or not to copy by Hector Manrique and Michael Walker. This was a co-authored paper with Dean, and Hector and Michael, as well as Carl Friston, had appeared several weeks before on some active inference live streams to discuss their work, Snakes and Ladders and Paleoanthropology, from cognitive surprise to skillfulness a million years ago. And then, due to the nature of the journal where they were publishing their work, we were invited to give a comment on the work. Broadly, we just said we were excited to engage and continue engaging, and that it's a very cool area of research and really astonishing in its scope. And so we just wanted to commend the research and put in our own 2 to 4 cents. Active Blockfronts is a project that has been operating for several years at the Institute. And one of the primary contributors here is Jakob, though there are others. And active Blockfronts, as it says in the title of this publication from 2023, is a combination of 2 techniques or methods. It combines active inference generative modeling with CAD, which is an open source framework for complex systems analysis and design produced by Block Science. And again, to this point of the difference between active inference analytical representations and pseudocode and the implementation in the last mile of the code itself, we realized that especially when we were considering multi-agent settings, we would need a lot of expressivity around the execution order and nuances about execution around the model. So imagine if there was 100 agents or 100 nestmates, you could have one scenario where nestmate 1 did perception and then action, and then nestmate 2 perception and action, then nestmate 3 perception action, or all of them could perceive and all of them could act. But then what if they decide to go into the same square and they bump into each other? Do you revert that step in the simulation? Or if each one does sense making and decision making sequentially, how does that become parallelizable? Or do you give an unfair advantage to a nestmate that always goes first? Or how do you actually control the execution order in these large simulations? And so we developed a grid world test setting that eventually we expect will connect to the GNN representations, to EOS, and be used to model large state spaces of active inference cognitive models using the kind of reliability and rigor that CAD and systems engineering brings to the table. In 2023, another paper with Jakob, we wrote Generative Research Teams, Active Inference Compositions for Research and Meta-Science. This was happening early in the large language model, autonomous agent, multi-agent times. And so we wanted to bring together 3 threads. First was active inference and the capacity to describe flexibly different cognitive ecosystems. The second thread was large language models, generative AI, and the third thread was cognitive security. And so we kind of discussed those all in close context, provided a ton of resource, and also some really funny prompts and meta prompts. Not to say that we developed the most advanced autonomous research team. However, it was very thought-provoking, and we know it's an important direction along the way. Lastly, for 2023 in the active inference space, along with many, many co-authors, which was awesome to see, we wrote a summary of the Active Inference Institute and the Active Inference ecosystem. We began briefly with citing many places that active inference is being applied already, but spent most of the paper pointing to what we have done and the directions we plan to go, as well as our values. So this was really a massively collaborative project. It was part of our work in applying for the now submitted Pathways to Open Source Ecosystems Sustainability grant from the NSF. And this is just the first version of a living document. It was really exciting to collaborate with so many. In the entomology working area, in 2020, along with Professor Johnson and Professor Linksfair, we wrote a review article, Distributed Physiology and the Molecular Basis of Social Life in the Eusocial Insects. Professor Linksfair had previously written an article, The Implications of Being Truly Social for the Eusocial Insects, something like this, where the long-term evolutionary context of eusociality is discussed in terms of its implications for behavior. And here we focused a little bit more specifically on physiology and the processes of physiology that occur at the colony scale. We reviewed various empirical findings and patterns that help us understand distributed physiology and pointed to the utility and the tractability and mystery of using the eusocial insects as systems of interest or as model systems for analyzing distributed physiological questions. In 2021, with a host of co-authors, we wrote Active Inference, an active inference framework for ant colony behavior. So the context is that while for decades people have been very interested in studying cognitive modeling in ants and drawing conclusions from the arising emergent phenomena associated with ant colony simulations or optimizations, there's very little interoperability in ant colony simulations, which is why there's so many toy examples and so few research programs that actually integrate, for example, multisensory data into the simulation. So it's easy to get to step 1 with ant modeling. However, it really seems like few research directions go past that. Let me just recollapse these. I reload the page. If it wasn't clear, I prepared this all only in the last few hours, so hopefully everything makes sense. I'll reload it again. All right. And so we wanted to use active inference to do a few things. First, to simply apply active inference to ants, which had not been done. It was Maxwell who came up with a pun in the title, by the way. And then also to encompass the first active inference model of environmental stigmergy, or niche modification with a pheromone application. And so this is already an exciting direction. We want to continue developing active inference models of ant colonies for their own sake and for the transferability to other distributed systems. In entomology in 2023, working with Eric Sound, a really great colleague, we collaborated on a single pheromone model accounts for empirical patterns of ant colony foraging previously modeled using 2 pheromones. And this is one of those titles that just says it all. In short, there was a 2009 paper, empirical study in ants by Dusator et al., and they used a Y-maze apparatus to study decision-making at the colony level in the big-headed ant, Pheidole megacephala. And they provided a mathematical model of the empirical data that had two pheromones that were both attractants. One had a longer lasting lifespan on the ground, the other one was more volatile and quickly evaporating. And so the idea, which totally makes sense and it's totally plausible, that there's multiple attractant pheromones with different lifespans. And in fact, it's not just plausible, it's absolutely likely that pheromones are mixtures of different molecules. However, we noticed that there was no comparison of a 2 pheromone model, or the 2PM, with a 1 or a 3 pheromone model. And so Eric introduced some very interesting psychophysical techniques, which we'll return to in the highlights, that helped us develop and validate a 1 pheromone model, which more parsimoniously and biologically explains the observed foraging activities. In 2023, in entomology, working with Judy Wexler and Sebastian Alvarado, we were guest editors at the Jove Journal of Video Experimentation in the entomology video collection. And so this is a short editorial, Experimental Entomology in the Age of Video, where we talked about how awesome and timeless entomology is, and then how video methods increase the impact and accessibility of entomology as a science in application. Of Ants and Aging was an invited presentation that I gave at a aging conference. And I talked about aging using the framework of Tinbergen's 4 questions, which is a pluralistic interrogative framework that Tinbergen introduced around ethology. And so I'm not really a scholar of aging or have too much of an insight into that field in humans. However, there's a lot to say about the process in ants. Okay, into cognitive security. In 2020, with R.J. Corday, our book that compiled all the works from the year was The Great Preset, Remote Teams, and Operational Art. Just continuing on, since we'll talk about the papers there in the coming minutes. These are not in the order of publication, but they're all here. In 2020, we collaborated on the Innovator's Catechism with Professor Steve Phelan. And the Innovator's Catechism built off of or modified the Facilitator's Catechism, which was a more general operations order or op-ord for any kind of remote team or emergent team or in-person team. And with Steve Phelan's expertise, we fine-tuned that into the innovation setting. So there's a lot of different reviews and analysis of different techniques that are used to bring high reliability innovation into play, especially for early stage teams that are market facing. And we continue to use the Innovator's Catechism as a question-based approach to organizing our own innovation teams over the coming years. In Reimagining Maps with RJ and Mikkel Marone from Mapbox, we were studying geospatial mapping and geospatial intelligence. We highlighted the concept of a map as this kind of key nomadic concept and performed review of mapping techniques and frames across different fields, ranging from the most abstract and mathematical to the most obviously applicable, like geospatial mapping, but also several other areas, such as educational mapping. And who knows? But we had a great time writing the work. We identified a lot of challenges, and we hope that we brought some new insights into the geospatial space. Facilitator's Catechism was really a keystone work that RJ led the way on. He performed an extensive analysis, historical review of operations orders through time, especially in high reliability military settings. And we developed the Facilitator's Catechism as kind of a fork or an addendum to a catechism that had already made its way into the research setting through George Heilmeyer at DARPA in the United States, whereas previously catechisms were to be found in 2 main contexts. The first is in dogmatic transmission of fixed question and answer pairs for memorization, which is how some people know about catechism, or catechisms as orders or directives, op-ords, in high reliability organizations. And we took it in a third direction, building off of Hallmeyer's introduction of the catechism format into the research space, and developed a flexible question and answer based approach towards emergent teams that has served us immensely many times over the previous years. In Infinite Games for Infinite Teams, RJ and I were participating in a polyplexus incubator around the concept of remote culture in 2020, as we all were, weren't we? And we had some riffs and directions on not just infinite games, so games that continue on, but also infinite teams with rotation of personnel, augmented teams, instantaneous remote teams in the gray zone, and different kinds of improvisational games that they can play that also do useful things. The first paper that RJ and I wrote together was published in May 2020, and it was Emergent Teams for Complex Threats. We studied terrorism and counterterrorism activities and the role of high reliability organizations that use emergent teams to address emerging threats, and also moving beyond the concept of threat surface, which implies that there's some sort of surface that could be hardened or softened, but to look into the space of complex cascading threats that look beyond a surface or a vector and deal with more of the endogenous dynamics of complex systems. In 2021, working with RJ and Scott David, we wrote Active Inference and Modeling Conflict. This was a key area to apply active inference to, and this paper filled that gap preliminarily, or respected that gap in a few different ways. First, we performed literature review on qualitative and formal and quantitative analyses of conflict. It's not all just prose. It was actually very interesting to learn about the different kinds of quantitative techniques that people have taken towards the study of conflict and cooperation. And we introduced the active inference in modeling conflict model, AIC, as a way to talk about active inference in informational or cyber-physical commons across the BOLTS domains: business, operation, legal, technical, and social. This was an acronym that Scott had used for years, and this kind of gave it its citation. We also connected the active inference generative model, the POMDP, partially observable Markov decision process, to the OODA loop of John Boyd: observe, orient, decide, act. So that's been a very fruitful connection as well, and was great to have that first connection. Facilitators Catechism Playbook was with RJ, and it was written in response to some feedback that we got on the Facilitators Catechism paper itself, which was that the paper reads like a 50 or 60 page history article, and it does. And so the playbook is a how-to, is just giving details, a step-by-step guide on how to use the Facilitators Catechism. And so we've been super happy to see people adopting the Facilitators Catechism, and also to let us know that they found the playbook or the guidebooks useful. It wasn't just reading the research article that made them want to do things differently and rethink collaboration, but rather that some of these more applied works made a difference too. Our 2021 book was Narrative Information Ecosystems, Conflict and Trust on the Endless Frontier. The Innovators Digital Playbook was written with RJ and Monica Kang, and I'll return to this in the highlights section, but the Innovators Digital Playbook did for the Innovators Catechism what the Facilitators Catechism Playbook did for the Facilitators Catechism book. It brought the Innovators Catechism much closer to application for people, and Monica, in the first half of this playbook, provides a ton of other great and cheerful and useful notes about remote work in general. Working with RJ and Mrigla Mascarenhas, we embarked on a multi-paper sequence that integrated our three different backgrounds: coming together in the work called EcoMeme, or Digital Rhetorical Ecosystem Analysis, Sense-Making of Digital Mimetic Discourse. And so here I brought the ecology, Marigela brought the rhetorical analysis, RJ brought the information and environmental awareness, and we introduced the DRE3 model, the Digital Rhetoric Ecosystem three-tiered model, DRE3, that allows us to analyze in a human interpretable and small scale, but also scaling towards larger scale way, how different formats of media in online multimedia discourse and hypertext play roles to advance claims, which is to say rhetoric. Narrative information management was written with RJ and several other colleagues, and that was around the idea of narratives in and of and by and for information management. And so each of the authors brought their expertise or passion for an area such as personal finance, ancestry research, hybrid cloud infrastructural security, neuroscience, and genomics. That was the section I wrote. And we talked about the role of narrative in general in the beginning and the end, and then had all of those domain-specific sections that talked about specific cases where narrative made a difference in those cases. Collaborative writing for catechism-based teams was with RJ, where we had another way of approaching this topic of making catechism-based collaboration more accessible, more relatable, more actionable. We had a great time working on this short piece. Also in 2021, with RJ, we wrote Knowledge Management Archipelago. And this paper arose as a kind of 2-week sprint where we were researching various areas related to library science, information sciences, knowledge management, and so on. And we were finding that seemingly for reasons of keyword alone, there would be relevant work in an area that was not being picked up in other areas. That was anecdotal, so we wanted to make that a little bit more rigorous. And so we performed a combinatoric co-occurrence analysis of the literature, and we visualized a lot of the connections and also potentially missed connections amongst some of those areas mentioned that are just broadly in the knowledge management and information science space, but again, they're not very connected from a citation or a co-occurrence point of view, even though they're semantically very close. That was 2021 in Cogsac. 2022 in Cogsac, with RJ and Marigela bringing on for some of these later works, Blue as well as Sarah. We continued EcoMeme, tracking public sense making through rhetorical annotation of image memes. Our 2022 book was Structuring the Information Commons, Open Standards and Cognitive Security. And this, again, is a book where it's all in the title. We wanted to take an Ostrom-style approach towards informational commons, thus information risk and communication. And the pieces of the puzzle that we wanted to bring into the subtitle were open standards and cognitive security. In 2022, RJ led on a collaborative project called TrustFinder, Recommendations for a Community-Based System for Finding Trusted Sources and Evaluating Claims. This was part of the work with RJ and Scott David at the UW APL IRS IRI, known as V, Verified Information Environments. And TrustFinder is an assertion-based information environment that allows different entities within a V, within a verified information environment, to make different assertions and for there to be integrity around tracing those assertions, which can include edits to code or commits, could be modifications of a document, it could be another kind of a stigmergic mark, but the TrustFinder environment supports a very granular and very hopefully effective way to organize some of these information environments that we find ourselves now being able to develop from the inside out. In 2023, in Cogsac, our primary ongoing project has been Atlas, which is a composable pattern language for cognitive phenomena. There's no publication yet, so I won't go into too much more detail here. We also wrote a response to an RFI, request for information, from the NTIA, National Telecommunications Information Agency. And this was a collaborative work with Scott David at the UW APL IRS IRI, myself at Active Inference Institute, Jumana from Pivot for Humanity, and RJ from Cogsac. And we highlighted in the space of AI accountability during this year of AI whirlwinding, we highlighted a few of our memes and themes around synthetic intelligence systems. Specifically, we talked about data reference standards, professionalization looking like guilds, and some insurance schemes. As with all of these citations, there's more information in the paper if you want to check it out, or we have continued the conversation, so there's even more we know now. But this was a great opportunity to provide, hopefully, timely insight into an ongoing, larger scale discussion. In the metascience space, in 2022, working with Ranen Tamari and several others, we wrote From Users to Sensemakers on the pivotal role of stigmergic social annotation in the quest for collective sensemaking. This article was a great first artifact from our Common Sense Makers team, and we situated the online attention environment in terms of cognitive models and open source attention, with digital stigmergy being all the likes and clicks and shares and modifications that people make to these different platforms, be they more Web 2 monolithic platform-like or more Web 3 or decentralized federated systems. And we continued working in this open source attention space. In 2023, Renan and I partnered up again, and we wrote, Open Access Science Needs Open Science Sensemaking. Awesome. Open infrastructure for sharing scientific sensemaking data. So here we pointed to the importance of hosting not just available PDFs, not just available and reproducible scientific primary data, but also developing interoperability around secondary sensemaking data. For example, sometimes when you go to a paper and you see it on the journal website, there's no comment section. There might be an alt metric, but the alt metric is a proprietary captured metric. And so we want to have composable, legible systems where we can have credible entry and exit of various kinds of sense making and do all kinds of compositions that we might want to do using EOS. And pretty recently, working with Andrew Claros, we wrote up a quick little sketch on using Noster, which is a federated messaging system, to develop index cards and use them in knowledge engineering. This is kind of like a stub that we just wanted to get it out there to ensure the Creative Commons and open source basis for it, as with most of our work. And we continue to work in this space. There's a lot of really exciting directions, and it's been awesome to work with Andrew on this direction. And last section of working areas, philosophy and the arts. So neuroscience of decision-making. This was an interview that I did with Alexandra, interviewing UC Davis professor Tim Hanks. And we talked about decision-making in the brain, Bayesian statistics, and different ways to do empirical modeling of decision-making and cognition about human decisions. In 2022, again with Alexandra, we interviewed Robert Sapolsky, and the interview was called On Free Will or the Lack Thereof. And in this article, we explored a few pieces, asked a few questions that Professor Sapolsky had not been asked before, wanted to get some of the new takes that he's bringing in the book that he is writing, but as far as I understand has not been released, which we didn't read, Determined: The Science of Life Without Free Will. And so it's a avenue of Sapolsky's research that he's been working on for about 20 years. There's a 2004 paper where he talks about the criminal justice system and free will. And so we just wanted to kind of trace that and catch up with him in 2022. And then in 2023, I gave a presentation called William Blake and Buckminster Fuller, Lives in Juxtaposition, A Study in Comprehensivity. And I'll return to this one in the highlights section, but this was for 52 Living Ideas, And in this work, I provided a side-by-side of these two men, William Blake and Buckminster Fuller, and drew out a few things from there. All right, so that's the kind of overview section. Now let's go to the highlights. First, the highlights in biology. So it was a huge highlight and achievement representing what began with email discussions with Carl Friston and colleagues in around 2017, grasping at what we now have here, wondering if there could be a way to use multi-scale active inference to provide an analytical scaffold for Eco, Evo, Devo. It's not over yet. There's so much more to do, and there's more gaps within gaps within gaps. However, we wouldn't have it any other way, and to have locked in this renormalization group-based formalism, it significantly extends the applicability of active inference and free energy principle, and just another lens or motif that is coming into the picture with modern active inference modeling. And so it's just very exciting to think about biological systems this way and to see how it all is coming together in terms of multi-scale complex adaptive systems. Here are some images from the work with Eric on the single pheromone model. So here's the experiment that Dusator et al. Did, where in one setting, the nestmates were allowed to travel to and from the food, but blocked from going to the other branch on the right for experiment 1. And then the gates were opened and they were able to explore both branches. Whereas in experiment 2, the branch without food was visited, but there was no food at the end. And then they combined these two, and then they studied what happened. And empirically what they found was that there was a faster switch to find the food on both branches in the case where the right branch had previously been explored. And so again, they proposed a 2-pheromone model that tried to capture that. Our 1-pheromone model uses only a single pheromone. You could think of it as being lightly applied if there's no food found, and then more heavily applied when food is found. And Eric introduced, from his background in psychophysics, several more biologically reasonable amplification functions. For example, it's very common in ant colony pheromone modeling, where if there's like 3 units of pheromone on the ground, the 3 just goes into the nestmate's head. And it's like, okay, 3 on the ground maps to a 3 in the brain, and 10 on the ground maps to a 10 in the brain, which is, funny enough, exactly how we did it in active infer ants and how it's done in most settings. However, psychophysically, it's much more plausible that there's this kind of an amplification curve. You can think about this like being able to detect a small difference in light is easier in a dark room, like the one I'm in. But a small difference in light in a bright room is not as noticeable. And so with that kind of a amplification curve from actual to perceived pheromone intensity, we were able to take a geometrical approach to understanding decision-making in this Y maze. And through simulations, we were able to recapitulate the empirical data, just showing that cognitive models really have to be unpacked. And it's hard to say things when there's so many ways that cognitive systems can be, which is why it doesn't end with the first model. That's just the beginning to identify future studies that are relevant. Next section for highlights, active inference. And this is a B circle that's out west of Davis. So in 2021, the active inference paper, again, was the first active inference model of stigmergic collective behavior. Though we have not developed extensively on it, I'm very excited for this framework or something analogous to it to be used to study the amazing diversity of ant behaviors, 15,000 species of ants or more or whatever, and all the other collective behaviors out there in the world. And while foraging is a very exciting and dopaminergic task, there's a lot of other ant tasks that are severely under-modeled, like nursing care, but foraging and to a lesser extent construction have been at least modeled. And it just shows how fast things are evolving and unrolling, that this was before the PyMDP Python package was in play. And so Alec Chance wrote the first version of the code, and then we worked on it together to adapt it from the cultural vision model that Axel and others had written earlier in the year, I believe. So it was a fun model, great to get that hands-on active inference modeling, and it helped me understand active modeling a little bit better. Here's the active inference and modeling conflict paper. Here's a figure that wasn't in the paper. This is the Rumsfeld quadrant model. And interestingly, in the Rumsfeld quote, as well as in many other places where you'll see people using the quote, they actually only mention 3 of the quadrants, and then there's this forgotten quadrant, which is the unknown known. So that's very deep, and we had many fun conversations around that. This work was the first to apply active inference to this multi-scale conflict cooperation setting, and so it set the foundation for a lot of our further work in cognitive security, applying the OODA loop and thinking within and among organizational setting. And again, it's kind of the key citation for bolts. So here we have 2 entities, could be a person and a DAO, it could be 2 companies, it could be 2 states, and they're interacting on the B, O, L, T, and S interfaces. Here's a mapping between active inference, action perception loop, and the OODA loop. And here's a situation of the AIC model amidst other models that are either more or less, realistically less formal, and then more or less historical timeline oriented versus tactically oriented. And closing out the highlights in the active inference area, writing this paper with so many awesome colleagues on the Institute and the ecosystem was truly, truly a highlight. Just the process was great. It was meaningful. It was great. Also, as part of the highlights, throughout the 3 years, I did 375 around there live streams on active inference. They're all available with transcripts, and have had many other opportunities to engage with several dozen interns, with 2 cohorts of our scientific advisory board, with our first cohort of our board of directors and officers, Alex and Blue, and so many nestmates. So I just can't wait for people to participate more in the Institute and make the ecosystem everything that we are excited for it to even be in the direction towards. Highlights in the area of cognitive security. Here's another field outside of Davis, and this was an early setup of my office in Briggs Hall at Davis. Well, it was truly a highlight to work with RJ, who developed Cogsac, Cognitive Security and Education Forum, and very graciously and generously allowed me to participate. We really co-mentored. We went in as a dyad, and we've talked basically every day for the last years. So RJ, thank you, sir. Great work. It was really incredible. It remains to be incredible to work with you. At the end of 2020, 21, and 22, each year we issued a volume compiling our work. In 20 and 21, we were the only 2 editors, but not the authors only. And in 2022, Scott David was also an editor. This year, 2023, our ongoing initiative is Alice. So this has just been a great and hopefully useful journey. So to all the Cogsac colleagues, thanks for working on what we were able to work on. And to just highlight one work in the Cogsac space that also dovetails with kind of the signs of the times and just the way things were in 2020. In 2020, I was able to participate in some facilitation trainings and activities that were hosted by Monica Kang at Innovators Box. I joined one episode of her podcast, Dear Workplace, episode 15, No Such Thing as Stupid Questions. There we are. I was able to participate in this very vibrant and fun community of people who cared about facilitation, cared about each other, and working with Monica specifically on the Innovators Digital Playbook was an amazing experience. Really, I had never worked on something that was approached, maybe to say, to be beautiful and accessible, and to really think about how the work was going to be digested and seen and used. Monica brought an awareness and a value alignment that made that very real for RJ and I. And as mentioned a little bit earlier, she wrote the first half of the book, and then we followed up with the second half on the more step-by-step. But just as this image shows, everybody plays a role. And outside of research, here's some caps from William Blake and Buckminster Fuller when it was presented for 52 Living Ideas on January 8th of this year. And this was just super fun. It was also very deep and meaningful. CJ Fernley, who I had spoken with and emailed with him, and he had given me helpful feedback on my work. He passed away, and he, along with Shrikant from 52 Living Ideas, set in play an absolutely incredible cascade. And on a bi-weekly timeline, meetings with the Trim Tab reading group facilitated by Kurt, interestingly, who I met actually through Monica's facilitation work. In the background, there's been such amazing scholarship and life around synergetics and Bucky Fuller and the Way of the Spheres. And so it's been a great collaboration with the modern Bucky Fuller and synergetics appreciators. I've long been in that camp, and then also over the last several years came to learn a lot more about William Blake, reading all of his works a lot, and reading biographies and other scholarship about Blake. And so this presentation, to be able to bring it together in the spirit of collaborating for comprehensivity and CJ, was really special. On the personal and art side, I did a lot of drawing, mainly in the first half of the postdoc. Honestly, slowed down my drawing activity as more and more things came up and more live streams were needing to be not drawing. But I did many silent live streams with drawings. Did 17 on synergetics, going through Bucky Fuller's original text primarily, and then several other paper streams reviewing papers of my own and colleagues or of other people. Basically, if I ever had to prepare for lab meeting, just prepare it and do it as a live stream. And sort of to close out the highlights, this slide summarizes the mostly unnamed colony. I see many of them here in the live chat, which is awesome and epic, but most of us have no names most of the time, and that's totally chill. Complexity Adventures, previously Complexity Weekend, has been great and a journey. Block Science, the CAD developers, and Zargum and everything with MetaGov and Block Science. Kernel community, and also here just some chat icons, all the different fragmented messaging platforms that we participate across, specifically at Kernel with Sid and with Jason, the D-School project. International Society for the System Science, ISSS, where with many colleagues of all ages were able to talk about education and knowledge engineering. Alias, the interdisciplinary research group on the diversity of consciousness, the group that through Martin Fortier, who has passed away, got me into the active inference game at all. Remoter consulting with RJ and Ben, no longer active / never active, were we? Common Sense Makers and that whole crew. Information Professionals Association and Cybernetics Society, a little bit more on the professional side. Stig People, more informally. Curio Cards and different activities in crypto, and APO Ideas with Tucker and others. So it's been a journey. All right. That was the end of the dot one. Now for the dot two. So this is a very short section that I'll cover just ultra briefly. And then I will check the YouTube live chat. So if you're watching live, please add any comments or questions, and I will try to address everything. So here's a little mirror picture. Here's another mirror picture. And here's with Alexandra overlooking Lake Berryessa. It wouldn't be a dot two without a strange loop. So in fact, only 1 hour before the stream, I saved the slides as a PDF, uploaded them to Zenodo, got another Zenodo up there that again can be interacted with through cognitivesecurity.us. So let's see what that looks like. Down here, here's the Postdoc review, and you can go to Perplexity, click on the link, and you can continue the conversation, and you can ask questions about this presentation itself or any of the other works. But Hofstadter's work and Strange Loop and Gödel Escher Bach are key inspirations, and so it was a fun way to tuck the loop by bringing Strange Loop into play. And here's my last slide. Here's my stalwart bike resting. I didn't need to rest. The bike did, though. On a dirt road somewhere near Davis. And I'd like to thank my family, friends, nestmates, the niche and beyond. Every day was an opportunity, an honor, a blessing, and a journey. And I acknowledge many, many contributions. I am and will be active in research, education, and service. People can get involved in the listed open source projects and communities. I really encourage people to be involved. I know some of the finest and most fun moments are when we really co-create. So I hope that people join through that broad gate and get inspired and do whatever they're moved to do. People can get in touch with questions, comments, and offers. I really do expect and prefer to be your advocate, ally, and colleague. If you respect my time, I will do everything I can to leverage yours. Read between the lines and among the lines. Do quantum active inference, and unity is plural and at minimum too. And in closing, before I look to the chat, there is much more to come. It is a rising and not a setting sun. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Hope that the few little live stream glitches were not too distracting. It is what it is. Live streaming breaks the fourth wall. So now I'm going to scroll back and look at the chat. Okay. Fun emojis. Hello, Dave Douglas. Hello, Upcycle Club. Shirley, Dean, Kirby, Neutrino, Luke, Church of Entropy, Glia Maximalist. Thank you, everybody, for all these fun messages. If people have a question, then please feel free to write it. Meanwhile, I'm just going to show one Perplexity example just to see what it looks like, just to get it on the stream with interacting with Perplexity. So let's do it for the Eco Evo Devo paper. Meanwhile, though, please feel free to write a question. It could be about a paper. It could be about anything. So the paper was uploaded, and here's the output that I copied into the website. This might be a little bit underspecified, but write Python pseudocode that makes a simulation for this paper. Early days for language models. Let's see how it does. Yeah, not the worst. Not the worst. Looks cool. It's so promising to be able to bring the papers into play like this. What can we even say? Okay. First question. Upcycle Club wrote, congrats. Thank you. I have one question. Is your 2021 active inference paper an optimal foraging model? Good question. This is in reference to optimal foraging theory, or OFT. In this paper, we did not explicitly compare the performance of the colony to OFT. Like, what would the kind of best strategy have been? Kind of like the best investing strategy. However, we were able to measure colony phenotypes. So it is possible to then test against optimal foraging. There's a few other interesting pieces. Optimal foraging is always defined against some optimization function. And so in the case of, for example, the harvester ants that I studied in graduate school, that wasn't just about time and food intake. That also had to do with water loss. So it turns out that just like something being maximally rewarding kind of like hides the problem itself, like defining the reward function, similarly in optimal foraging theory, sometimes a lot of the hard work is tucked into that notion of optimality, in the sense that just because the colony isn't getting as much food as it could per unit of time, it might be doing a trade-off like minimizing its risk of predation or water loss. So it's quite hard to say what is truly optimal, and that has kind of made optimal foraging theory a useful heuristic, but needing a lot more unpacking before being tested empirically. In another sense, though, because these are active inference generative models, we could say that they're performing Bayes optimally. Again, that doesn't mean that the colony is going to live or that it's foraging like the most possibly, but it means that given its generative model parameters, it is unrolling, the ball is rolling downhill, everything is as it is. Hope that addresses it, but that's a great direction. I'm really excited to like bring in features like multimodal sensor fusion, like having vision as well as multiple pheromones in the ants, internal sense of heading, path integration. There's just a lot of cool phenomena that could be brought into play composably with the active inference model, and then that could be used to test against like optimal foraging, all these other things. Okay. Shirley, did you make any agent-based models of any of your papers where they could be applicable? So the active inference model is an agent-based model. Several of the other works definitely could be applied to the multi-agent, agent-based model. One very fascinating piece of the collaboration with Eric in the single pheromone model, I really had only thought about modeling ant colony behavior in terms of agent-based simulation. But in fact, this was a dynamical model that still recapitulated the empirical phenomena. So this was a dynamical equation, but it wasn't like we were simulating 50 or 100 or 200 nestmates. It was actually kind of like a mean field approximation. As their two pheromone was, we modified that one with the one, but that was like very interesting. So it's almost like if you don't see an agent-based model, it's a great place to build one. And I know that you've made some in really important areas, Shirley. And then like when we do see the agent-based model or have that, then we have the other side with the dynamical model and getting that kind of like smooth mean field overview, even though we know that it's agentic. And I believe that speaks to a big direction in multi-scale modeling, which is kind of like that view from the bottom with the arising and the interactions amongst heterogeneous subunits, as the program says. And then the view from the top is the analytical, clean niceties. And we have an account of a phenomena, at least moving towards an account, I believe, when we have both the bottom up and the top down modeling meeting in the middle and agreeing with unique explanations and predictions. Like if you have the dynamical model of the muscle's exhaustion or of the neuron firing from the top down, and then you have the simulation of muscle fibers or of lipids in the membrane or something like that from the bottom up, and if the bottom up and the top down are meeting in the same place, then it's at least looking like an account. Glia Maximalist wrote, "What was your favorite research paper that you worked on? Favorite piece of art?" Whew. Favorite piece of art? Life overall. Favorite research paper? I mean, active inference, probably. That was like very exciting to develop it during graduate school, although it was published in 2021, which was based upon like reviewer comments and all these other things. The discussion had arisen earlier. In fact, just to give a little bit of like history and connection on the active inference and then the renormalization group variational synthesis paper. So when I emailed Carl et al., I wanted to explore active inference, FEP, being applied to Eco Evo Devo. And while we were having the email discourse 2017, 2018, 2019, Axel, Maxwell, et al. Were releasing groundbreaking papers like variational ethology, different papers on the niche and on ecology. So it's like we were continuing the discourse. I was out there, on the west coast of the US emailing with these people who were nowhere near, and like they were making these incredible developments and like leapfrogging and shadowing and moving ahead, and just as it is in the ActInf area, like dropping exciting papers with high frequency. And so we decided to approach the Eco Evo setting of the ant colony. And then that kind of split into two works. First, we're like, wait a minute, the big grand variational synthesis is a different project than the ant colony simulation. So let's just go for the tactical ant colony simulation. That was Inference in 21. Once we got that off, then we turned back to the broader theoretical biology. And actually that underwent another mitosis. So that split into two papers. The first one has been published, and that is the analytical part with the renormalization group and all the formalisms. And that benefited greatly by Blue Knight, Chris Fields, and John Campbell, who also unfortunately passed away. But that work spoke to the theoretical side of the synthesis. And then the work that I'm excited to continue in that area is revisiting some of the classic equations in evolutionary biology, like the Breeder's equation, the Price equation, all these different evolutionary and quantitative genetic equations that have been used for different population genetic areas, like agriculture, but also evolutionary biology. And I suspect, / expect and prefer, that it will be possible to show some of these massively multilinear equations, Landian-Arnold, 1983, Price equation. So phenotypic and genotypic change within and across generations, within and across populations, that has been approached from a massively multilinear perspective. And I suspect it will be possible to find that that is a limited or a special case of broader nonlinear relationships between, for example, genotype and phenotype, or genotype and fitness, or phenotype and fitness. So if that could be shown, it would be like active inference getting grandparented in to the last 100 years of theoretical biology, because then when we see a paper from 1989 talking about kin selection or group selection or heritability or some of these other concepts, we could know that we were dealing with a setting that was later generalized through active inference. So that would be quite an interesting maneuver, and the formal relationship only has to be demonstrated once. But if we can demonstrate, for example, that there is information between genotype and phenotype, but while in the GWAS setting, that is done with massively multilinear regressions, and we just generalize that to a mutual information approach. For example, let's just say that if you have two of the lowercase allele or two of the uppercase allele, you have the same phenotype, but then if you have a heterozygous state, then you have a higher phenotype. So at the population scale, the regression of genotype versus phenotype is flat because it looks like an upside down U, and then you have a regression line that goes straight through it. And so that wouldn't be significantly different than 0. And so one might be tempted to think from that analysis that like there's no relationship of that genotype location on that phenotype. But if you think about that from a mutual information perspective, it's actually highly informative. It's just that it has a non-linear effect, which is that the homozygotes are similar to each other and the heterozygote has higher phenotype value. So if we could generalize what are currently approached in a multilinear framework with these more generalized nonlinear functions, worst case scenario, we'll recapitulate the multilinear finding. Best case scenario, we have amazing wealths of empirical data and questions that could be reapproached. So that would be a great direction. Okay, I'll just wait like one more minute if anyone else wants to write a question. Thank you, Maurice. All right. Then I think I will end it. Thank you, everybody who is watching live or in replay. I really can't express it all, but that's not what speech is for. So I hope that everybody feels welcome and encouraged and like they've been part of my work. I know that's how I feel. I know it feels like our work is also part of a bigger picture in a better way, which would be big if true. But it would be big even for what it is. So I will end it there with no more platitudes, but I really look forward to people getting in touch and engaging with the material. There's never been a more exciting time to learn and apply, to make it accessible and rigorous and applicable, and just to be in the game. So, till next time.